Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. One of the seemingly consistent things about creative destruction, particularly as a result of technology, is that we have a short memory for what came before. We remember just immediately preceding a dramatic shift in some vital element of our lives. It has the patina of making us nostalgic for the remembered past, even as we forget the broad history. This certainly seems to be true of journalism. We look at the landscape of what venture capitalist Jason Calacanis calls late-stage journalism, and we see a world that is certainly far from what folks once thought was the golden age of journalism in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. But as a part of history, the picture is different. And perhaps when we see that difference, we get a better picture of how we can adapt to the economic, political, and social needs of journalism today. To talk about this, I'm joined by my guest, Nicholas Lemann. Nick Lemann is the Joseph Pulitzer and Edith Pulitzer Moore Professor of Journalism and Dean Emeritus of the Faculty of Journalism at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. He's been a staff writer at The New Yorker, Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia. He launched Columbia Global Reports, a unique publishing imprint that produces 6 ambitious works of journalism a year, and he has personally published 5 books. It is my pleasure to welcome Nicholas Lemann here to talk about a recent article he did for the New York Review of Books entitled, Can Journalism Be Saved? Nick, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here. One of the things that you talk about in the article is the degree to which we look at the situation today with respect to journalism through the lens of what some people refer to as kind of the golden age of journalism, things that went on in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and maybe a little bit beyond, and that becomes the kind of measure by which we judge everything today. And that was a particularly unique historical moment and really doesn't reflect the broad history of journalism. Talk a little bit about that first.
I should say that, in the days when I was the dean of a journalism school especially, I had to go to a lot of banquets and hotel ballrooms of various journalism organizations. And you typically hear somebody get up and say that when the founders wrote the First Amendment, they pretty much had in mind the world of journalism as we see it now, which, of course, is very ahistorical. Journalism has a long, tangled history. The actual word journalism basically didn't exist very much at the time that the U.S. was founded, and there weren't any reporters as we know them now or news organizations. So the fact that they came along is a kind of happy accident. But journalism has a long, complicated, ever-changing history, and we're in one of the moments of change right now. What we think of as normal, at least we aging baby boomers, is, as you said, an atypical period that began, around 1970 and lasted until around 2000. It was disrupted by the internet. In this period, broadcast journalism was heavily regulated for at least most of this period and was a stable and limited world. And in most cities in the country, there was one monopoly or quasi-monopoly newspaper that was very profitable and could afford to invest heavily in journalism. So that was a temporary set of conditions, highly temporary as it turned out, that people like me thought was normal and eternal. And so mea culpa for my generation, we didn't pay a lot of attention to exactly what made our business possible in terms of government policy and economic reality and so on. And in fact, most of the time, as journalists love to do, instead of saying, isn't it great that we live in a golden age, we complained relentlessly about things like corporate owners who weren't willing to invest enough in their newsrooms. But, now we're nostalgic.
Are we looking at a period now that is perhaps a little more stable in terms of the influence of outside forces, and might it provide a more solid foundation or a slightly more solid foundation from which to go to whatever the next plateau is. I mean, one of the things, and you just touched on this, the impact of broadcast journalism, the impact of deregulation of that, deregulation of radio, and the way it gave rise to conservative talk radio, and then the internet. All of those things were external forces that played a big role. It seems as if nothing is as influential right now in terms of destruction, and that it might be a time in which things can stabilize to some extent.
Right. Well, I appreciate your optimism. I would say that two things I want to highlight on a more pessimistic note. One is I am just frustrated that my colleagues in journalism really don't like to talk about this in a rational way. And instead, there's always some, version of like when the cavalry rides to the rescue in the old Western movies. Something's going to happen that's going to save us magically. So I think it would be really helpful to have an honest conversation about what the options are. The biggest thing going on that affects, people employed in journalism is that the advertising has left and gone to the internet, particularly to Google and Facebook, which really dominate online advertising globally. There are various schemes for the news business to get that advertising back, but I haven't seen any of them work so far. And so I think that the mega market fact is that the main way that at least newspapers and commercial broadcast supported themselves, which is through advertising, has been radically decreased, especially in the case of newspapers. And no other form of market support has come into view that's nearly as good. So that's hard to change, at least I think. And then in terms of kind of what the rule book is for journalism, I'll pick up on what you said. We decided in the latter years of the 20th century that this very constricted and highly regulated world we'd set up, especially for broadcast, was really too limited and too constricted, and that the value that we should put first is a lot of freedom of people to say whatever they wanted on air in quotes, or hear whatever they wanted on air. And that's the world we live in now. So the reason that there wasn't talk radio and craziness on the internet and so on back in the old days was that the government forbade it. So, we might have a conversation about what kind of world do we want to live in here? Do we want a world that privileges freedom very highly, knowing that we're not going to like a lot of what that produces? Or do we want a world that is going to be frustrating in other ways?
What's interesting, too, is that some of those models, and radio, I suppose, is a good example, even talk radio, which was built on meanness originally and then sort of morphed with conservative politics, that even those avenues are no longer advertiser supported, that the internet and technology and destruction has had an impact on reshaping those things as well. So it's not a completely flat landscape.
Right. So going back to the advertising point, you have, Google and Facebook dominant platforms, and Twitter to some extent, and so on. But Google and Facebook are really the biggies. They claim that they are not in the business of creating content at all, and yet they have taken huge amounts, the majority of advertising, away from entities that are in the business of creating content and that believed that their content was the key to their business success. So again, that's a mega economic fact that the traditional media industry hasn't really figured out how to deal with yet, as far as I can tell.
To what extent is it troubling or positive as we look at newspapers in particular today and see that philanthropy on both a national and particularly on a local level has been helpful, combined with the resources of billionaires.
Yeah, so that's sort of philanthropy and quasi-philanthropy, right? So I think I'm not against it. I think it's a positive development. I think it's less the answer, in quotes, than a lot of people are perceiving it as being, and that's for a number of reasons. One, philanthropy, the total philanthropic commitment to journalism is really quite small. It's growing from a very low base, but it's quite small, not enough merely to replace the many thousands, tens of thousands of jobs that have been lost in the field. I think the billionaire owner types in particular only want to buy certain kinds of publications. They don't want to buy, the paper in a small town in an industrial area. Just out of the goodness of their heart, they tend to want some of the ego gratification that comes from owning a large, more glamorous product. And then also, philanthropists sometimes are not the most benign owners. The word philanthropist provides a cover, but they can dictate coverage and things like that. Some do, some don't. So I think it's a positive development that is not a systemic solution to the problem.
In some ways, the philanthropy, with all of its problems, seems less toxic, particularly in terms of local news, local information, than something like Sinclair. I mean, it's surprising that model hasn't happened with local newspapers as well.
Right. Well, I think that with Sinclair, a company like that would probably be afraid. You could buy a lot of local newspapers for very little money right now. But the question is, how would you pay for it? Not so much how would you pay for the purchase price, but how would you pay for the operations? So I think that's why you haven't seen that in that area. And if those are the choices, I would definitely say go with philanthropy. But I still think there's a problem for what do you do with those parts of journalism that either existed in the golden age or never existed, that the country needs, that philanthropy has not chosen to pay for and is unlikely to choose to pay for. And that's an unsolved problem.
One of the things that we seem to be living through right now is the way in which all of this is reflected through the lens of the current kind of political dynamic, and that people feel that journalism is booming and flourishing because it's all focused on the White House and Trump, forgetting that it's being left behind in so many other areas.
Yeah, I could not agree more. So just to pick up on that, first of all, I know this is really counterintuitive to a lot of people. The best thing about American journalism right now is the coverage of Donald Trump. And I know that there's a lot of people out there who think that the press is giving him a free ride, et cetera. But, he gets a lot of coverage, and a lot of it is quite good. The problem is much more, if you live in California and you want to see great coverage of the state government in Sacramento, it's just really hard to find because a lot of those people who used to do that have just disappeared. This is one of the largest governments in the world, as you know, and that's where the heart of the problem is. There's one other thing here, and in this article that you're mentioning that I wrote, and I've been advocating this for years, I think we should consider some kind of a government subsidy system for journalism, especially local journalism about public institutions and government. The typical person I talk to about this says, so you want Donald Trump to control the funding for journalism? And the answer is no, I don't. That's a moment that we're in, and there are many, many ways of funding things through the government that are politically sensitive that don't involve the president or members of Congress personally turning the faucet on and off. So, while we have this administration in office, we also have, I'd say, essentially all the climate research that's going on in the U.S. is paid for by the U.S. government. And a great deal of it is fantastic. It's why we know there's a crisis. So there are a lot of mechanisms for shielding activities from that are paid for by government from the direct control of government. You see this all over the world and all over the U.S. in areas outside of journalism.
Isn't that akin to kind of the public broadcasting model that we have right now with respect to NPR and just the overall Corporation for Public Broadcasting? Isn't it parallel to that?
Yeah, absolutely. These entities on a global comparative scale are less government subsidized than most public broadcasting elsewhere in the world. They get, as you know, a very small percent of their funds directly from government and much more from philanthropy and listeners. But yeah, they were founded by the U.S. government, and I think they're a fantastic addition in my lifetime to the landscape of what's available in journalism. So yes, that is the model. It's, to put it in a nutshell, it's think about public broadcasting, don't think about state broadcasting, such as exists in totalitarian countries.
The problem, I guess, is that because everything today is so politicized that those things are always under the threat of being cut off. I mean, how many stories have we all seen about funding being cut off for NPR and public television, et cetera?
I know that, first of all, any possible thing that you think about doing in life has to be considered not in comparison to another situation that's perfect, but another realistic assessment of what are the, flawed alternatives to what you're thinking about. What really changed my thinking on this was going from a lifetime spent in newsrooms to being a primary resident of a university, of a research university. Columbia University, where I work, gets $1 billion a year from the federal government in research funds. And that's in addition to a lot of direct and indirect subsidies. It's lots and lots of this research is politically unpopular or controversial. It involves things like climate change and many other topics. And if you talk to people in the research world, they say, oh my gosh, it's never been this terrible as it is now with our, $1 billion a year and 99.9% total freedom to pursue what we want. But, it looks like a pretty good system to me. And then what makes it work is there's 3 levels of cutoff between the funding and the actual research, so that it's not possible for a member of Congress or a president to just turn the water off. But yes, if you do this, there will always be controversies and there will always be attempts to shut down the funding, as there have been for many years about NPR. And, as a listener, NPR seems pretty great to me, even if it lives under constant threat.
Talk a little bit about the paywalls, about subscriptions, and the way people seem to be willing to pay for that on a certain level, and what it means and doesn't mean.
Okay, so I'm a pessimist about paywalls. I wish I were not, but I just want to say, certainly in the newspaper business, almost no newspapers have been able to make a paywall work. And you could say it's their fault because they're not providing good enough content. But by general consensus, the only one that really has been able to make it work is the New York Times. Maybe the Washington Post. They don't have to publish as much data as the New York Times because they're privately held. And, a lot of the regional papers that are really great have dropped their paywalls because they just couldn't get their audience to pay for what they offer. You're competing with so much free material online that it's just very, very, very hard to make it work. And I think that people extrapolate way too much from the success of the New York Times or some, kind of business-oriented publications like the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal to say this can work for the Sacramento Bee. I don't know that it can.
Can we learn anything by looking at the success, in quotes, of things like the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times using a paywall, and even some sports sites that have been incredibly successful with paid content? Can they teach us anything about the degree people are willing to pay for something that we might look at?
They can. But the findings are pretty slim. So you're right. Anything that's sort of economically actionable business content is more likely to be paid for. Anything that feeds into, rabid local sports fan populations is more likely to be paid for. Newspapers and other news organizations now can tell exactly how many people are reading every single thing. But from a standpoint of the society at large, what used to happen is, it's clear, in the golden age, whether or not it was really golden, is that, if you were a paper like, the San Francisco Chronicle, people were, the investigative reporting was not why people subscribed to the paper, and it wasn't why advertisers advertised in the paper. It was being cross-subsidized by the things that were making the paper work economically, which included not just business and sports news, but also just pure information, like when movies were playing, stock tables, classified ads, and the weather and things like that. You can't put the horse back in the barn. That's just free information that people don't have to go and get from a news organization. So, we've had a really robust, I'm sorry to say, real-time experiment with this over the last, 10 years or more. And papers have had quite dispiriting results with getting people to become real paying subscribers online. Even the New York Times discounts very heavily and uses a number of tricks to make the number look a little bigger than it is. So I wish it were true that the subscriber model would work for, big metro papers and local papers. I wish I could say there's a clear playbook they can follow, but I'm not seeing it.
Is the industry, and I know it's a broad brush, but is the journalism business being realistic today about where it is and what these options are?
Well, the people that I hang out with are the journalists themselves, and I would say not really. We love what we do, and we want to be able to do it collectively. We want that, and we want it individually. And we seize on everything that might look promising as a hope that might work, including some of what we talked about, the philanthropic support, benign billionaire support, subscriber support, digital-only platforms like Vox and BuzzFeed. But I don't hear a really robust, realistic conversation among my colleagues about what the options are. I think it's something we're not trained to think about. When Joseph Pulitzer started Columbia Journalism School back in 1903, he wrote this kind of wonderful, inspiring essay about what he thought the journalism school should be. And he said, something like, no journalist in my school should ever have to learn anything about the business side of journalism because that would, corrupt them and soil them. And they must only learn how to be great journalists, and other people will worry about how to pay for it. So, that message really took for the last century with a lot of journalists, including me. In recent years, we did violate his wishes and start requiring a course of all of our students on the economics of journalism, because we felt like it's not a good idea to send journalists out into the world in blissful, complete ignorance of how their business gets paid for and just assuming somebody will pay for it. So anyway, that's just a way of saying journalists are not trained to think about these things. They don't like to think about these things. We like to do our work. It's like saying to actors, you need to think about the economic structure of the theater and movie industry. It doesn't come naturally. And so I think that conversation could be there could be a lot more of it than there is now. I hope there will be.
And yet, before I let you go, one last thing. There are so many journalists that understand the value of, for lack of a better word, celebrity, that understand that being on television or being on radio or being in other media is important to their success as journalists. Talk about that finally.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of the, so we all talk about and know about inequality in the U.S. and globally and how it's ever rising. The people that you're talking about are, a percent of the total number of working journalists. That is, people that, recognizable name, television stars who make millions of dollars a year. Wonderful. I'm happy for them, but that's not a typical life of a journalist, and it's a sort of separate topic from what I think is the most pressing social and political issue, which is who's going to cover governors, state governments, mayors, city governments, the big business entities in a city. Those people, the TV superstar anchors, they're not going to do that coverage, and there aren't enough of them anyway. So I think that's a wonderful happenstance that affects a handful of people, not a business model for journalism.
But the other part of that is the print journalists that are all over cable television, for example, and even on the local level, where what few local print journalists there are in some communities also have a presence on local television or local radio or what have you.
Yeah, so I don't know, and of course then there's Twitter and right. Online platforms. I don't know if you're a local journalist how much money that puts in your pocket or whether it puts any money in your pocket. I think that's a separate topic from the economic crisis in journalism and the tremendous reduction in the number of employed journalists in the U.S. in this still young century. These are jobs, the kind of jobs you're talking about, whether they're a second job or a first job, basically involve, going on TV and commenting on things. The great value of journalism for the country is original reporting and beat reporting, really going out and gathering information and putting it before the public that wasn't out there before, not just saying, here's my take on this, here's my take on that. So I still think, you can say what you want about it. I personally think a lot of reporters are too eager to give quick takes either online or on broadcast platforms on things they don't really know that much about. I just think we really have to keep the focus on original journalistic reporting and thinking about what would reverse the really alarming decline in that we've seen, especially below the very glamorous national covering the White House level.
Nicholas Lemann, his article, Can Journalism Be Saved?, is in the New York Review of Books. Nick, I thank you so much for spending time with us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it too.
Thank you.